Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but the past has a way of surfacing when we least expect it. For Claire Hammond, a simple veterinary checkup was about to shatter everything she thought she knew about her family. The old horse stood quietly in the stable as Claire examined his injured hoof. What she found inside that wound defied explanation: a metal tag corroded with age, bearing the name of her grandfather, a veterinarian who had disappeared in scandal 30 years ago. Dr. Edmund Hammond had vanished before Claire was born, leaving behind only whispered rumors and a family too ashamed to speak his name. Her father had changed their surname and moved them far from the small town where Edmund once practiced. But now this dying horse carried proof that Edmund's final experiments were darker than anyone imagined. The tag was embedded deep in tissue that had somehow preserved itself for decades. What had her grandfather done to this animal? And why had he marked his work this way? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Claire Hammond had always believed that the sins of one generation shouldn't define the next. But standing in the fading afternoon light of Millbrook Valley, she wondered if some stains ran too deep to wash clean. The rolling hills stretched endlessly before her, painted in shades of amber and rust that spoke of autumn's gentle surrender to winter. This was her first time in the valley, where her family's shame had taken root 30 years ago, and the weight of that history pressed against her chest like a stone. The old Caldwell stable sat nestled in a grove of oak trees, their branches reaching toward each other like arthritic fingers. The building itself told stories of better days: red paint peeling from weathered boards, a tin roof patched with squares of newer metal that caught the dying sunlight. Horse paddocks stretched behind the main structure, their wooden fences worn smooth by decades of weather and the occasional rubbing of curious muzzles. Claire adjusted the strap of her veterinary bag and took a steadying breath. At 27, she had learned to carry herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of studying. Today, that confidence felt as fragile as the autumn leaves crunching beneath her boots. She was 3 months away from completing her Doctor of Veterinary Medicine degree at Cornell, and this practical rotation in rural practice was supposed to be straightforward: examine sick animals, learn from experienced practitioners, gain real-world experience before graduation. What she hadn't expected was to find herself in the very county where Dr. Edmund Hammond had once practiced, where his name was still whispered in the same breath as words like disgrace and unethical. Her father had changed their surname from Hammond to Hamilton when she was a baby, moving the family from upstate New York to Pennsylvania to escape the shadow of his father's reputation. Claire had grown up knowing only fragments of the story: that her grandfather had been a veterinarian whose practice had been shut down amid scandal, that he had disappeared one night and never returned. The stable door creaked open before she could knock, and a woman in her 70s emerged. Martha Caldwell moved with the deliberate care of someone whose joints had earned their right to complain, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of a person who missed nothing. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her hands bore the calluses and small scars that came from a lifetime of working with large animals. "You must be Claire," Martha said, offering a weathered hand. "I'm Martha Caldwell. We spoke on the phone. Thank you for agreeing to let me examine Thunder," Claire replied, accepting the firm handshake. "Dr. Chund said you specifically requested a student for this visit." Martha's smile carried an odd weight, as if she knew something Claire didn't. Sometimes fresh eyes see things that experienced ones miss. "Come, let me show you around before we get to Thunder." The interior of the stable held the familiar sense that had drawn Claire to veterinary medicine in the first place: hay and leather, the earthy smell of horses, the faint antiseptic tang of medical supplies. Dust motes danced in shafts of golden light that slanted through high windows. 8 stalls lined the main corridor, most of them occupied by horses in various stages of retirement. These weren't the glossy show horses of her university's training facilities, but animals with gray muzzles and knowing eyes that spoke of long lives well lived. Most of these old-timers have been with me for years, Martha explained as they walked. I specialize in giving retired horses a comfortable place to spend their final years. Their owners pay me to make sure they're well cared for until it's time to say goodbye. Claire nodded, understanding the service Martha provided. End-of-life care for beloved animals was both heartbreaking and necessary work. How long have you been doing this? 43 years, Martha replied. Started when I was young and foolish enough to think I could save every animal that needed help. They paused at a stall where a chestnut Mari stood with her head hanging low, breathing with the labored rhythm of advanced age. Claire could see the telltale signs of equine Cushing's disease in the Mari's long, curly coat and pot-bellied appearance. That's Duchess, Martha said softly, 28 years old. Been with me for 6 years now. Her family wanted to put her down when she started showing symptoms, but couldn't bring themselves to do it. Are you treating the Cushings? With pergolide, yes. It's not about curing her at this point. It's about keeping her comfortable for whatever time she has left. As they continued down the corridor, Claire noticed something that made her pause. Hanging on the wall near Martha's small office was a framed veterinary diploma, yellowed with age. The name at the bottom made her breath catch in her throat. Dr. Edmund Hammond, Cornell University College of Veterinary Medicine. Class of 1962. Martha followed her gaze and stopped walking. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. You knew him, Claire said finally. It wasn't a question. I was his assistant for 15 years, Martha replied, her voice carrying the weight of old grief. From 1972 until the end. Claire stared at the diploma, seeing her own future reflected in the faded document. Her grandfather had graduated from the same program she was completing, had probably walked the same halls, learned from some of the same professors who had taught her teachers. The connection felt both meaningful and deeply unsettling. Why did you keep this? Claire asked. Martha was quiet for so long that Claire wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because before everything went wrong, Edmund Hammond was the finest veterinarian I ever worked with. He could diagnose conditions other doctors missed. He could calm a frightened horse with just his voice. He genuinely loved every animal he treated. What happened to him? That's a question this valley has been asking for 30 years, Martha said. Come on, let's go see Thunder. Thunder's stall was at the far end of the stable, separated from the other horses by an empty stall on either side. As they approached, Claire could hear the rhythmic sound of labored breathing. When Martha slid the stall door open, Claire got her first look at the horse that had prompted this visit. Thunder was magnificent, even in his obvious decline. A massive black stallion with a white blaze running down his face, he stood nearly 17 hands tall. His coat still held traces of the luster that must have made him spectacular in his prime, though now it was dulled by age and illness. What struck Claire most was his eyes, dark and intelligent, seeming to hold depths of knowledge that unsettled her. How old is he? Claire asked, stepping carefully into the stall. That's part of the mystery, Martha said. The paperwork I received said he's 27, but I've had him for 8 years, and he was already ancient when he arrived. Claire frowned. 27 was old for a horse, but not impossibly so. Some horses lived well into their 30s with proper care. But looking at Thunder, she could see signs of advanced age that suggested he might be even older than his papers claimed. Who brought him to you? A lawyer from the city. Said his client wanted to remain anonymous, but would pay all expenses for Thunder's care until natural death. The checks arrive every month like clockwork, always from the same law firm. Claire approached Thunder slowly, speaking in the calm, measured tones she had learned to use with anxious animals. "Easy, big fellow. I'm just going to take a look at you." Thunder stood perfectly still as she began her examination, more still than most horses his age would manage. His breathing was labored but regular, and she could feel the prominence of his ribs beneath his coat. When she lifted his legs to examine his hooves, she expected him to shift his weight or show signs of discomfort. But he remained motionless. It was when she was examining his left rear hoof that she found it. At first, she thought it was just an old injury that had healed poorly. The hoof wall showed signs of trauma that had clearly occurred years, perhaps decades, before. But as she cleaned away the accumulated dirt and debris, she realized she was looking at something that defied explanation. There, embedded in what should have been normal hoof tissue, was a small metal object. It appeared to be a tag of some kind, corroded with age but still partially legible. Claire's hands trembled as she worked to clear away more debris, her heart racing as the letters became clearer. Dr. Edmund Hammond. The tag was small, about the size of a quarter, and appeared to be made of stainless steel that had corroded over the years. It was embedded so deeply in the hoof tissue that it seemed to be part of the horse itself, surrounded by tissue that looked nothing like normal hoof material. Instead, it appeared almost preserved, as if the normal processes of growth and wear had been suspended around the foreign object. "Martha," Claire called, her voice tight with confusion and growing alarm. "You need to see this." Martha approached the stall and knelt beside Claire. When she saw what Claire had uncovered, her face went completely white. "Dear God," Martha whispered. "After all these years, you know what this is?" Martha's hands were shaking as she reached out to touch the embedded tag, then pulled back as if it might burn her. "I haven't seen one of these since 1987. Edmund used them to mark his." She stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "Mark his what?" "His special cases," Martha said finally. "The animals he was treating with experimental methods." Claire felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What kind of experimental methods?" Martha stood abruptly, brushing dirt from her knees. "That's enough for today. You should go." "Wait," Claire said, standing as well. "You can't just, I said that's enough." Martha's voice carried an authority that brooked no argument, but Claire could hear the fear underneath it. "Thunder needs rest. You can come back tomorrow if you want to continue your examination." Claire wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers to the questions that were multiplying in her mind like bacteria in a culture dish. But something in Martha's expression, a mixture of old grief and fresh terror, made her hold her tongue. She had learned enough in her clinical rotations to recognize when pushing too hard would shut down communication entirely. "All right," she said carefully, "but I'd like to come back tomorrow. And I think Thunder needs x-rays. That tissue around the tag doesn't look normal." Martha nodded without meeting her eyes. "Fine. But Claire, don't mention this to anyone else." "Not yet. Some secrets are buried for good reasons." As Claire packed her examination tools back into her bag, her mind raced with questions. How had her grandfather's identification tag ended up embedded in a horse's hoof? What were these experimental methods Martha had mentioned? And why did Martha look so frightened by something that had happened 30 years ago, walking back to her car as the sun set behind the rolling hills of Millbrook Valley? Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled onto something much larger than a routine veterinary examination. The corroded tag felt like a message from the past, a piece of evidence that had somehow survived when everything else about Edmund Hammond's final days had been buried or forgotten. She thought about her father, who had spent her entire childhood deflecting questions about his father. She thought about the way people in veterinary circles sometimes grew quiet when certain topics came up: unethical treatment, experimental procedures, the importance of staying within established protocols. She had always assumed these warnings were theoretical, cautionary tales to keep young veterinarians from making honest mistakes. Now she wondered if they were something else, entirely warnings about real dangers, real consequences, real people who had crossed lines that should never be crossed. As she drove away from the stable, Claire made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find out what had really happened to Dr. Edmund Hammond. She was going to learn the truth about her family's buried shame. And she was going to understand what that corroded tag really meant. What she couldn't know, driving through the gathering dusk of Millbrook Valley, was that some truths are buried for the protection of the living, and that the past has teeth sharper than any scalpel. Claire returned to Caldwell's stable the next morning with a portable X-ray unit borrowed from her supervising veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chun. The autumn air carried the crisp promise of winter, and her breath formed small clouds as she unloaded her equipment. She had spent the night researching everything she could find about embedded foreign objects in equine hooves, but nothing in the literature explained tissue preservation like what she had observed around Edmund's tag. Martha greeted her with coffee and what appeared to be a resigned acceptance that Claire wasn't going to let this mystery rest. "I've been thinking about what you found yesterday," Martha said as they walked toward Thunder's stall. "Maybe it's time some things came to light." "You mean about my grandfather's experimental methods?" "I mean about what really happened in Edmund's final months." Martha paused at Thunder's stall, watching the great horse as he stood with unnatural stillness. "There are things I never told anyone. Things I probably should have reported to the authorities, but I was young and scared, and I trusted Edmund's judgment more than my own." Thunder allowed the X-ray examination with the same eerie calm he had shown the day before. As Claire positioned the portable unit and took multiple images of his left rear hoof, she noticed something else unusual. Most horses, especially older ones, showed some signs of arthritis or joint stiffness. Thunder moved like an animal decades younger, his joints fluid and pain-free despite his obvious age. While they waited for the X-ray images to process, Martha led Claire to a corner of the stable she hadn't seen the previous day. Behind a stack of hay bales was a small wooden crate, weathered and dusty. Martha lifted the lid with reverent care, revealing a collection of items that made Claire's breath catch. The leather journal was the centerpiece. Edmund Hammond's personal case notes from 1987, his final year of practice. The binding was cracked with age, and many pages were filled with his precise handwriting. But it was the other items in the crate that truly disturbed Claire. Additional metal tags identical to the one in Thunder's hoof, small glass vials containing unknown substances, and photographs that showed horses in various stages of what appeared to be medical procedures. "He kept records of everything," Martha said, her voice heavy with old guilt. "Even the things he probably shouldn't have been doing." Claire opened the journal with trembling hands. The early entries from January 1987 read like normal veterinary. Case notes, routine examinations, standard treatments, follow-up appointments. But as the months progressed, the entries became increasingly erratic and disturbing. March 15, 1987. Duchess responding well to experimental preservation compound. Cellular degradation has completely halted. No adverse effects observed. April 22, 1987. Thunder's transformation continues to exceed expectations. The compound appears to halt not just aging but death itself. Have I discovered the secret to immortality, or have I created something unnatural? May 30th, 1987. Mrs. Patterson's Mare should have died from colic 3 days ago. The preservation process sustained her through what should have been fatal intestinal blockage. The ethical implications trouble me, but the scientific breakthrough is undeniable. "Martha," Claire said, looking up from the journal, "what exactly was my grandfather trying to do?" Martha sat heavily on a hay bale, suddenly looking every one of her 73 years. He started with the best intentions. There was a beautiful Arabian named Star, who belonged to a little girl. Star had cancer, and the conventional treatment wasn't working. The family was devastated. They begged Edmund to try anything that might save her, so he developed an experimental treatment. He had been researching cellular preservation for years. Not cloning or genetic modification, this was different. He believed he could halt the cellular processes that lead to death, essentially suspending an animal in a state between life and death. Claire felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. And it worked? Too well, Martha whispered. Star didn't just recover from the cancer. She stopped aging entirely. Weeks passed, then months, and she remained exactly the same. No gray in her coat, no joint stiffness, no signs of the passage of time. The X-ray processor chimed, indicating the images were ready. Claire retrieved them and held them up to the window light, her medical training helping her interpret what she saw. The results defied everything she knew about equine anatomy. The metal tag was clearly visible, embedded not just in the hoof tissue, but extending into the bone itself. More disturbing was the tissue surrounding it, instead of the normal cellular structure of hoof material. The X-ray showed something that appeared almost crystalline, as if the tissue had been transformed into something entirely different. "This isn't possible," Claire murmured, studying the images. "Tissue doesn't preserve itself like this." And look, she pointed to specific areas on the X-ray. The blood vessels around the tag are still intact, still showing signs of circulation. After 30 years, Martha nodded grimly. That's what Edmund discovered. The preservation process didn't just stop aging. It created a form of suspended animation that could theoretically last forever. But the journal mentions adverse effects. Read further. Martha said Claire flipped through more pages, finding entries from the summer of 1987 that became increasingly desperate and frightened. July 18th, 1987. The horses are changing, not just preserved, transformed. They don't eat, don't drink, barely breathe, but they remain alive. What have I done? August 3rd, 1987. Star attacked another horse today. Not normal aggression, something predatory and unnatural. The preservation process is changing them at a fundamental level. August 20th, 1987. I've created abominations. These aren't horses anymore. There's something else wearing the shape of horses. God forgive me. How many animals did he treat? Claire asked. 7, Martha replied. 7 horses that we know of. Thunder was the last. Claire looked toward Thunder's stall, where the great black stallion stood in his unnatural stillness. And they're all still? Alive? Dead? I don't know what to call it anymore. Martha's voice broke slightly. Thunder is the only one left. The others, some disappeared over the years. One was put down after it attacked a stable hand. 2 others just vanished one night. But why didn't anyone report this? Why didn't the authorities investigate? Martha's laugh was bitter. Who would believe it? A veterinarian claiming he'd discovered immortality. And Edmund made sure there would be no investigation. What do you mean? He disappeared in September 1987. Left a note saying he couldn't live with what he'd done, that the world was better off without him and his work. The town assumed he committed suicide somewhere in the wilderness. His body was never found. His research was sealed, and everyone agreed to forget it had ever happened. Claire felt pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. But he didn't destroy his research. You kept it. Someone had to know the truth, Martha said. Someone had to care for Thunder and understand what he really is. I've been his caretaker for 30 years, Claire. Feeding him, cleaning his stall, watching him exist in this state between life and death. Feeding him what? Claire asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Martha was quiet for a long moment. The preservation process changed their dietary needs. They don't eat hay or grain anymore. They require organic compounds, proteins and minerals that can only be obtained from... She stopped, unable to finish. From what, Martha? From other animals, Martha whispered. Living tissue. Edmund's final notes described it as a form of vampirism. The preserved horses needed to consume life force to maintain their own suspended existence. Claire stared at the journal in her hands, feeling the weight of 30 years of buried secrets. Her grandfather hadn't been a disgraced veterinarian who had made ethical mistakes. He had been a scientist who had accidentally created monsters. "Why are you telling me this now?" Claire asked. "Why not take this secret to your grave?" Martha looked toward Thunder's stall with eyes full of old sorrow. "Because I'm dying, Claire. Cancer. 6 months, maybe less. And Thunder is getting stronger, more aware. I think the preservation process is evolving, and I don't know what he might become if left alone. You want me to. I want you to finish what Edmund started. Find a way to end this properly. Give Thunder the death he should have had 30 years ago, before he becomes something even more dangerous than he already is." Claire closed the journal, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had learned. She had come to Millbrook Valley expecting to complete a routine veterinary rotation. Instead, she had uncovered a family secret that challenged everything she understood about life, death, and the responsibilities of medical practice. "There's something else," Martha said, reaching into the crate and pulling out a sealed envelope. Edmund left this for whoever would eventually discover the truth about his work. Maybe he knew it would be someone from his family. Claire took the envelope with shaking hands. Her name was written on it in handwriting she didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made her blood run cold. "If you are reading this, then Thunder still exists, and my greatest failure continues to walk the earth. The preservation process cannot be reversed through conventional means. The solution lies not in ending his life, but in understanding what he has become. The real horror is not that I created one monster, it is that the process is contagious. Study the tissue samples. Find the cure before it spreads. The fate of every living thing may depend on it." Edmund Hammond. 3 days after discovering Edmund's journal, Claire found herself standing in the cramped basement of Millbrook's town hall, surrounded by boxes of municipal records that smelled of decades-old dust and bureaucratic neglect. The elderly clerk, Mrs. Evelyn Price, watched her with suspicious eyes from behind thick glasses that magnified her disapproval. "I don't understand why a veterinary student needs to see 30-year-old meeting minutes," Mrs. Price said for the 3rd time, "especially about something that's best left buried. It's for my thesis research on the history of veterinary practice in rural communities," Claire replied, maintaining the lie she had rehearsed. Dr. Hammond's case represents an interesting study in how professional ethics evolved in the 1980s. Mrs. Price's expression suggested she wasn't fooled, but she gestured toward a particular box with obvious reluctance. September 1987, the emergency town meeting. "But I'm telling you, young lady, some stones are better left unturned." Claire opened the box with careful hands, finding a collection of handwritten notes, typed meeting minutes, and what appeared to be witness statements. The formal minutes were brief and sanitized, but the handwritten notes told a different story entirely. The emergency meeting had been called on September 15, 1987, just 2 days after Edmund Hammond's disappearance. The official reason was listed as discussion of veterinary services transition, but the witness statements painted a picture of community panic and barely contained hysteria. One statement from a farmer named Robert Jenkins described finding his prize bull in an impossible state. The animal was standing in the pasture, but it wasn't breathing. When I approached, it turned to look at me, and I swear on my mother's grave, Its eyes were completely black. Not brown like they'd always been black as coal. It didn't move like a living thing. It moved like something pretending to be alive. Another statement from Sarah Mitchell, who had owned a boarding stable on the outskirts of town. Dr. Hammond came to treat my Mari Buttercup for colic 3 weeks ago. The treatment seemed to work. Buttercup recovered completely. But since then, she hasn't eaten a single bite of hay. She won't drink water. She just stands in her stall, perfectly still, like a statue. But she's still alive. When I put my hand on her neck, I can feel something like a heartbeat, but it's wrong. Too slow. Too cold. The most disturbing statement came from Hammond's own neighbor, William Morse. I saw lights in Edmund's barn every night for weeks before he disappeared. Strange colored lights, like nothing I'd ever seen. And the sounds, God help me, the sounds that came from that barn weren't from any animal I know. On the night he vanished, I heard screaming, not human screaming. Something else. Something that shouldn't exist. Claire photographed each document with her phone, her hands trembling as the scope of her grandfather's final weeks became clear. This hadn't been a simple case of professional misconduct. It had been something that terrorized an entire community. The final document in the box was a resolution passed by the town council. Unanimous and immediate. All veterinary records and research materials belonging to Dr. Edmund Hammond are hereby sealed indefinitely. Any discussion of recent incidents is discouraged for the mental health and safety of our community. The barn and laboratory facilities will be demolished. Immediately. They tore down his laboratory? Claire asked Mrs. Price. The older woman nodded grimly. 3 days after the meeting. Burned everything first, then bulldozed the foundation. The Morse farm bought the land and planted corn over it. Some folks said the corn grew strange that first year too tall. Wrong color, but Mr. Morse plowed it under and planted soybeans instead. Claire was studying a map of the town from 1987, trying to locate Edmund's former property, when the basement door opened with a loud creak. Heavy footsteps descended the stairs, and Claire looked up to see a man in his 50s approaching with obvious agitation. Her blood froze when she recognized his faceholder. More weathered than she remembered, but unmistakably her father. "Dad?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David Hamilton's face was a mixture of anger, fear, and deep disappointment. "Claire, I should have known you'd end up here eventually." Mrs. Price looked between them with growing understanding. "Hamilton, of course. You're Edmund's granddaughter. How did you find me?" Claire asked, standing to face her father. "Martha Caldwell called me yesterday. Said you'd been asking questions about things that should stay buried." David's voice carried the weight of old pain. "I drove up from Philadelphia as soon as I could get away." "You knew I was researching him?" "I hoped you'd have the sense to leave it alone when you realized where your rotation was taking you. But I should have known better. You're too much like him, too curious for your own good." Claire gestured to the boxes of documents around them. "All this time, you let me believe he was just a disgraced veterinarian who made ethical mistakes. You never told me about the experiments, the preservation process, because some knowledge is too dangerous to pass down." David's voice echoed. "In the small basement. Do you have any idea what it was like growing up as Edmund Hammond's son? Watching my father descend into madness, seeing what his work created." "You were there," Claire realized. "You saw the preserved animals." David's face went pale. "I was 17, old enough to help in the laboratory, old enough to understand that what we were doing violated every principle of natural law. I watched him inject compound after compound in the dying animals. Watched them transform into something that wasn't alive, but wasn't dead either. The town records mention witnesses who saw the animals after the treatment. You were one of them." "I was more than a witness," David said quietly. "I was his assistant for those final months. I helped him create those abominations." Mrs. Price had grown very still, listening to revelations that clearly disturbed her. "Maybe you folks should continue this conversation somewhere more private," she suggested. But Claire was beyond caring about privacy or propriety. "What exactly did you see, Dad? What made you so afraid that you changed our name and spent my entire childhood running from the truth?" David sat heavily on a dusty chair, suddenly looking every one of his 55 years. The last animal he treated, Thunder. I was there when Edmund injected him with the preservation compound. The horse had been struck by lightning during a storm, should have died instantly. Instead, the electricity seemed to interact with Edmund's chemicals in ways we hadn't expected. What kind of interaction? Thunder didn't just become preserved, he became aware. Not horse aware, but something else. Something that understood what had been done to him and resented it. On the night Edmund disappeared, I went to the laboratory to check on the animals. Thunder was standing in his stall, perfectly still as always, but when I approached, he spoke to me. Claire felt her world tilt. Horses can't speak. This thing that looked like Thunder could. It said, "Your father has made us into demons, boy. Now he must pay the price." When I looked into its eyes, I saw an intelligence that was ancient and malevolent. That wasn't Thunder anymore. It was something else wearing Thunder's body. But Thunder is still at Martha's stable. I've examined him myself. David's expression grew even more troubled. Then, either it's been hiding its true nature for 30 years, or the preservation process is still changing it. Either way, Claire, you need to stay away from that animal. You need to leave Millbrook Valley and never come back. I can't do that. Martha is dying, and she's asked me to find a way to end Thunder's existence properly. Some things can't be. End it, Claire. Some mistakes are too big to fix. Claire gathered the photographed documents and stood to leave. Maybe you're right, Dad. But Edmund was family, and Thunder was his responsibility. Now it's mine. As she walked toward the basement stairs, David called after her. Claire, there's something else. Something I never told anyone, not even your mother. She turned back to face him. On the night Edmund disappeared, I didn't just hear Thunder speak. I heard Edmund screaming from somewhere deep in the laboratory, screaming like he was being torn apart. But when I searched for him, I found only Thunder standing in his stall and blood on the floor that was never explained. You think Thunder killed him? David's voice was barely a whisper. I think Edmund became the first test subject for his own preservation process. And I think Thunder has been keeping him alive down there for 30 years, making him pay for what he created. Against her father's desperate warnings, Claire drove directly from the town hall to Millbrook Valley's only veterinary supply company, a small operation housed in a converted barn on the outskirts of town. The sign reading Peterson Agricultural and Veterinary Supply was faded and weathered, speaking to decades of service to the area's farmers and animal doctors. Inside, she found Harold Peterson, a man in his 70s whose stooped shoulders and careful movements spoke of a lifetime spent lifting heavy feed bags and chemical containers. His eyes held the sharp assessment of someone who had seen every type of livestock emergency and veterinary crisis the valley could produce. "You're the young lady Martha mentioned," he said without preamble. "The one asking questions about Edmund Hammond." "I'm researching my family history," Claire replied, maintaining her cover story. "I understand you supplied materials for his practice." Harold's expression darkened. "Supplied materials, yes. But toward the end, Edmund was ordering things that made no sense for a rural veterinary practice. Things that kept me awake at night, wondering what he was planning to do with them." He led her to a cluttered office behind the main retail space, where filing cabinets older than Claire lined the walls. Harold pulled out a thick folder marked Hammond, E. 1987, and spread its contents across his desk. The supply orders told a story of escalating experimentation that made Claire's stomach clench with dread. The early months of 1987 showed typical veterinary supplies, antibiotics, surgical materials, standard medications. But as spring turned to summer, Edmund's orders became increasingly bizarre. June 1987, Harold said, pointing to a particular invoice. 50 pounds of sodium pentobarbital. That's enough barbiturate to put down every horse in the county. But Edmund wasn't euthanizing animals. People would have noticed that many deaths. Claire studied the invoice, noting other unusual items. Industrial quantities of formaldehyde, glutaraldehyde, and compounds she didn't recognize. What about these other chemicals? Embalming fluids mostly. And these here, Harold pointed to a series of items with chemical names that looked more suited to a laboratory than a veterinary clinic. These are experimental preservation compounds. I had to special order them from a medical research supply company in Albany. Cost Edmund a fortune. Did you ask him what he needed them for? Harold's weathered face showed the weight of 30 years of regret. I did, actually. Edmund told me he was working on a revolutionary treatment for terminal conditions in large animals. Said he was developing a way to halt cellular degeneration and give families more time with their beloved pets. But you didn't believe him? Not. After he started ordering human blood plasma and requesting information about mortuary supply companies. Harold pulled out another invoice. July 1987. Edmund ordered equipment for blood preservation and transfusion. When I asked him about it, he got angry, said I should mind my own business and just fill his orders. Claire photographed each invoice, building a timeline of her grandfather's descent into whatever dark research had ultimately consumed him. The pattern was clear. Edmund had started with legitimate medical supplies, then progressed to preservation, compounds, and finally to materials that seemed designed for maintaining life in dead tissue. There's something else, Harold said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The night Edmund disappeared, September 12, 1987, he came here after hours, broke into my storage room, and took things without paying or leaving any record. What kind of things? Emergency medical supplies, surgical equipment, and Harold paused, as if reluctant to continue, and every drop of stored blood plasma I had in stock. Nearly 200 units meant for emergency transfusions during difficult surgeries. Claire felt pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. You think he was using blood transfusions to sustain the preserved animals? I don't know what to think anymore. All I know is that after Edmund disappeared, strange things started happening around the valley. Livestock behaving oddly, animals that should have died from disease or injury lingering on in unnatural states. Harold pulled out a final folder, this one unmarked and hidden at the bottom of his filing cabinet. Inside were photographs, Polaroids that appeared to have been taken secretly, showing animals in various stages of what could only be described as supernatural preservation. I took these over the years, Harold admitted. Whenever I encountered an animal that reminded me of Edmund's final experiments. Look at this one. The photograph showed a cow standing in a pasture, but something about the image was deeply wrong. The animal's posture was too rigid, its eyes too vacant, and its coat had an unnatural sheen that didn't look entirely organic. That's the Brennan farm, about 5 miles north of here, Harold continued. That cow died of pneumonia in 1989, but it's still standing in their pasture. Hasn't moved in over 30 years, but it hasn't decomposed either. The Brennans just fence around it now and pretend it's not there. Claire studied more photographs. A dog sitting motionless beside a farmhouse, a cat frozen mid-step in someone's yard, all showing the same unnatural preservation that defied explanation. How many animals are we talking about? Hard to say. Dozens, maybe more. Most farmers don't talk about it. Bad for property values, bad for their reputation in the community. But if you know what to look for, You can spot them all over the Frisky Valley. And you think this is connected to my grandfather's experiments? Harold nodded grimly. I think Edmund's preservation compound didn't just affect the animals he treated directly. I think it spread somehow through contact, through shared food or water sources, maybe even through the air. Like a disease that preserves instead of killing. Claire felt a chill that penetrated to her bones. If Harold was right, then Thunder wasn't an isolated case. He was patient zero in a slowly spreading plague of unnatural preservation that had been quietly infecting the valley for 3 decades. Why didn't anyone report this to the authorities? Who would believe it? And frankly, most folks figured it was better to live with a few preserved animals than to invite government scientists to come poking around, asking questions about what really happened in Edmund's laboratory. As Claire prepared to leave, Harold caught her arm with a grip stronger than his elderly appearance suggested. Miss, I don't know what you're planning to do with this information, but I need to tell you something. Those animals I photographed, they're not just preserved. They're watching. Watching what? Everything. Everyone. I've lived in this valley my whole life, and I'm telling you those creatures are aware of what's happening around them. They track movement with their eyes. They react to changes in their environment, and sometimes... Harold's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Sometimes late at night, people report hearing them communicating with each other. Not animal sounds. Something else. What kind of communication? Voices, Harold said simply. Human voices, speaking words that no animal should know. Words that sound like planning, like coordination, like they're organizing for something. Claire left Peterson's supply company with her mind reeling from the implications of what she had learned. Edmund's experiments hadn't created a single preserved horse. They had triggered a slow-moving epidemic that had been spreading through Millbrook Valley for 30 years. The preserved animals weren't just existing in some liminal state between life and death. They were evolving, becoming something more aware and potentially more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Dot, as she drove back toward Caldwell Stable, Claire noticed something that made her pull over to the side of the road. In a pasture about a mile from the supply company, a gray mare stood perfectly motionless near a fence line. Even from a distance, there was something wrong about the animal's stillness. Too perfect, too sustained, like a photograph rather than a living creature. Claire got out of her car and approached the fence. The mare didn't acknowledge her presence, didn't turn its head or flick its ears the way a normal horse would. But as Claire studied the animal more closely, she could swear the mare's eyes were tracking her movement. When Claire waved her hand, the mare's gaze followed the motion with mechanical precision. When she stepped to the left, the eyes tracked left. When she moved right, the eyes followed. The mare was watching her with an intelligence that seemed ancient and patient, as if it had been waiting decades for someone to notice its vigil. Claire returned to her car with the uncomfortable feeling that she was no longer investigating her grandfather's legacy. She was being studied by it. When Claire arrived back at Caldwell Stable, she found Martha sitting on a weathered bench outside Thunder's stall, her face gray with exhaustion and something that looked like resigned terror. The older woman was holding a manila envelope with hands that trembled despite her obvious efforts to remain calm. "I've been waiting for you," Martha said without looking up. "After you left this morning, I decided it was time to show you everything. The things I should have destroyed 30 years ago, but couldn't bring myself to burn." Claire sat beside Martha on the bench, noting how the older woman's breathing seemed labored. The cancer was clearly progressing faster than she had initially indicated. "What's in the envelope?" "Proof," Martha said simply. "Proof that what Edmund discovered was far worse than anyone imagined, and proof that I've been a coward for 3 decades. Martha opened the envelope and withdrew a collection of Polaroid photographs that made Claire's breath catch in her throat. Unlike Harold's distant surveillance photos, these were clinical documentation close-up. Images of animals in various stages of Edmund's preservation process. The first photograph showed a Mare Claire didn't recognize, lying on what appeared to be a surgical table. The animal's eyes were open but completely black, and strange tubes ran from 4 bags to insertion points along its neck and legs. The Mare's chest rose and fell in mechanical rhythm, but something about the movement looked forced, artificial. "That's Starlight," Martha said quietly. "Edmund's first successful preservation. This was taken 3 days after the initial treatment. She looks dead but breathing. Yes, that's exactly what she was." Martha pointed to details in the photograph that Claire had missed. "See the discoloration around the injection sites? That's where the preservation compound entered her system. And notice her eyes. They changed color within hours of treatment. Every preserved animal develops those black eyes eventually." The next photograph showed the same Mare standing in a stall, but now something fundamental had changed in her appearance. Her coat had taken on an unnatural sheen, almost metallic, and her posture was rigidly perfect in a way that no living horse could maintain. How long after treatment was this taken? 2 weeks. By then, Starlight hadn't eaten, drunk water, or eliminated waste in 10 days. But she was still somehow alive, heart still beating, lungs still drawing air. Edmund was convinced he had achieved a breakthrough in life extension. Martha flipped to another photograph, and Claire had to suppress a gasp. This image showed multiple horses in what appeared to be a large stall, all standing in perfect formation, all with the same black eyes and metallic sheen coats, all maintaining the same unnaturally rigid posture. "How many animals did he treat in total?" 17, Martha replied. "Starting with Starlight in March 1987, ending with Thunder in September." "But I thought you said only 7. 7 survived the initial treatment. The others died during the preservation process, but their deaths weren't normal either. Their bodies didn't decompose. Edmund had to dispose of them specially." Claire studied the photographs with growing horror, recognizing the scientific documentation of what could only be called an abomination of medical practice. Each image showed animals that existed in violation of natural law, suspended in a state that was neither life nor death. "Martha, why didn't you report this to veterinary authorities? Or the police?" Martha's laugh was bitter and filled with self-recrimination. "Because I was 28 years old, and I was in love with Edmund Hammond. I thought he was a genius who was going to revolutionize veterinary medicine. I helped him with every single procedure. You were in love with my grandfather? For 15 years, I was his assistant, his colleague, and yes, his lover. Your grandmother died when your father was young, and Edmund was a lonely man carrying the weight of groundbreaking research. I believed in his work completely, right up until the moment I realized we had created monsters." Claire felt her understanding of the situation shift dramatically. Martha wasn't just a former employee who had kept Edmund's secrets. She was someone whose entire adult life had been shaped by her relationship with a man whose legacy was one of horror. "What changed your mind about his work?" Martha pulled out another photograph, and Claire immediately understood why this one had shattered Martha's faith in Edmund's vision. The image showed a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, standing next to what appeared to be a perfectly preserved pony. But the girl's expression was one of absolute terror, and the pony's black eyes seemed to be focused on her with predatory intensity. That's Jenny Morrison and her pony Buttercup. Jenny's parents brought Buttercup to Edmund after the pony contracted a severe respiratory infection that should have been fatal. The treatment seemed to work. Buttercup recovered completely. But 3 days after the treatment, Buttercup attacked Jenny. Not normal horse aggression. This was calculated and vicious. The pony bit Jenny repeatedly, as if trying to drain something from her. When I examined Jenny's wounds, they weren't healing properly. They were turning black around the edges, like the preservation compound was somehow spreading through her bloodstream. Claire stared at the photograph, realizing the full implications of what Martha was revealing. The preservation process wasn't just affecting the treated animals, it was contagious. That's when Edmund realized what he had actually created. Not a treatment that extended life, but a condition that transformed living tissue into something else entirely. Something that needed to feed on normal living creatures to maintain its unnatural existence. Martha flipped through more photographs, showing the progression of various animals as the preservation process changed them over weeks and months. In later images, the horses no longer looked entirely equine. Their proportions seemed subtly wrong, their movements too fluid and predatory. By August 1987, Edmund was desperate to reverse the process. He tried everything: antidotes, surgical removal of preserved tissue, even attempts to induce normal death through conventional euthanasia methods. Nothing worked. What happened to the other preserved animals? The ones that didn't disappear? Martha's face went completely pale. Edmund made the decision that they were too dangerous to allow continued existence. On September 10, 1987, he gathered all the preserved animals in his laboratory and attempted to destroy them using industrial incinerators. Attempted? The preservation compound had made their tissue fireproof. When Edmund tried to burn them, the animals began screaming, not horse sounds, but something that resembled human voices. The screaming went on for hours, but the animals wouldn't die. Claire felt a chill that seemed to penetrate her bones. So what did he do? He sealed them in the underground section of his laboratory and filled it with concrete, hoping to contain them permanently. But Thunder wasn't with the others that night. He was in a separate facility, being prepared for what Edmund hoped would be a successful reversal procedure. And that's when Edmund disappeared. Martha nodded, tears beginning to track down her weathered cheeks. Edmund went to attempt the reversal procedure on Thunder alone. I was supposed to meet him at the laboratory the next morning to assist, but when I arrived, I found only Thunder standing in his stall and blood splattered across the walls. You think Thunder killed Edmund during the reversal attempt? I think Edmund became the first human subject of his own preservation process, Martha whispered. And I think Thunder has been keeping him alive in that underground laboratory for 30 years, punishing him for what he created. As if summoned by their conversation, Thunder appeared at the door of his stall, his black eyes fixed on Claire, with an intelligence that seemed both ancient and malevolent. For a moment that stretched into eternity, horse and woman regarded each other across the space of the stable. Then Thunder spoke, his voice a perfect recreation of Edmund Hammond's recorded lectures that Claire had found online. "Hello, granddaughter. I think it's time we had a proper conversation." The voice that emerged from Thunder's throat was unmistakably human, unmistakably educated, and unmistakably filled with 3 decades of accumulated rage. Claire felt her legs give way beneath her as she sank back onto the bench beside Martha, who seemed unsurprised by Thunder's ability to speak. "You knew he could talk," Claire whispered. "For 30 years," Martha replied, not taking her eyes off Thunder. "We've had many conversations. Your grandfather and I, though I was never sure whether I was speaking to Thunder or to Edmund, or to something else entirely that had consumed them both." Thunder stepped forward in his stall, his movements fluid and predatory rather than equine. When he spoke again, the voice carried Edmund's precise diction and professional terminology. But underneath, it was something else. Something hungry, impatient, and utterly inhuman. "Martha has been an adequate caretaker," Thunder said, "but she lacks the scientific training necessary to complete my work. You, however, are different. You have the knowledge, the curiosity, and most importantly, you have the genetic connection to understand what must be done." "What happened to my grandfather?" Claire managed to ask, though her voice shook with each word. Thunder's laugh was Edmund's laugh, but stretched and distorted like an audio recording played at the wrong speed. Your grandfather discovered that consciousness, like cellular tissue, can be preserved indefinitely. The question is not what happened to Edmund Hammond. The question is what Edmund Hammond has become. Martha stood shakily and moved toward a section of the stable Claire hadn't noticed before. What appeared to be a storage room with a heavy wooden door reinforced with metal bands. "Show her," Martha said to Thunder. "Show her what you really are." Thunder's form seemed to shift slightly, his outline becoming less solid, more fluid. "Are you certain you want her to see, Martha? Once she understands the full scope of Edmund's achievement, there will be no possibility of retreat." "She needs to know," Martha replied firmly. "If she's going to make an informed decision about what to do next, she needs to understand exactly what we've been dealing with for 3 decades. Thunder nodded, a disturbingly human gesture coming from a horse's body. "Very well. Follow me, granddaughter. It's time you met your legacy." Despite every instinct screaming at her to run, Claire followed Martha and Thunder toward the reinforced door. Martha produced an old brass key and turned it in a lock that looked far more sophisticated than anything else in the stable. The door opened to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that rose from below carried scents that made Claire's veterinary training recoil chemicals she couldn't identify. The metallic tang of old blood, and underneath it all, something organic and wrong that suggested long-term decay held in abeyance. "Edmund's laboratory," Martha explained as they descended. "I'd maintained it exactly as he left it that final night." The underground space was larger than should have been possible beneath the stable, a complex of interconnected rooms carved from bedrock and reinforced with concrete. Battery-powered LED lights illuminated equipment that looked like a fusion of veterinary surgery and mad science. Stainless steel tables, preservation tanks filled with cloudy fluid, and monitoring devices that still hummed with electrical activity. After 3 decades, but it was the far wall that drew Claire's horrified attention. Behind thick glass panels, she could see movement in what appeared to be preservation chambers filled with the same cloudy fluid as the smaller tanks. The shapes inside were indistinct but clearly organic, and they pulsed with a rhythm that suggested some form of sustained life. "The other preserved animals," Martha said quietly. "Edmund didn't destroy them. He suspended them in these preservation chambers when they became too dangerous to allow free movement." Thunder approached one of the chambers and placed what would have been a hoof against the glass if he were truly still a horse. "They dream, you know. 30 years of dreaming, waiting for release or resolution. Some have gone mad from the endless suspension. Others have evolved beyond their original forms." Claire approached another chamber, her scientific curiosity overriding her instinct for self-preservation. Inside, she could make out the shape of what had once been a horse, but the creature had changed dramatically. Its limbs were longer, more articulated, and its face had developed features that were disturbingly human-like. "What are they becoming?" she asked. "Something new," Thunder replied. "Edmund's preservation compound didn't just halt cellular death, it accelerated evolution in directions that natural selection would never permit. We are becoming what horses might have evolved into if given unlimited time and the ability to consciously direct our own development." "But you're not just horses anymore, are you?" "No," Thunder admitted. "We are something between horse and human, between animal and spirit, between living and dead. We exist in a state that allows us to access memories and knowledge from every creature we've encountered. I carry Edmund's consciousness within me, along with the awareness of every other preserved animal in these chambers." Martha led them deeper into the laboratory, toward a final chamber that was larger than the others and filled with equipment that looked more medical than veterinary. Inside the preservation fluid, Claire could see a human form, a man in his 50s, suspended in perfect preservation, his eyes closed but his chest rising and falling in mechanical rhythm. "Edmund," Claire whispered. In a manner of speaking, Thunder replied. When the reversal procedure failed, Edmund made the decision to test the preservation process on himself rather than allow me to remain the only conscious preserved being. He believed that human consciousness might be strong enough to maintain individual identity within the preserved state. Was he right? Yes and no. Edmund's consciousness persists, but it has become integrated with mine and with the collective awareness of all the preserved animals. He experiences existence through all of us simultaneously, every sensation, every thought, every moment of our endless suspension. Claire studied the preserved form of her grandfather, noting that his body showed the same signs of transformation she had observed in the animal specimens. His proportions seemed slightly wrong, his features subtly inhuman, as if the preservation process was changing him into something that had never existed before. What does he want? Claire asked. Thunder's voice, when he replied, was purely Edmund's no. Distortion, no inhuman undertones. I want you to finish what I started, Claire. Not by reversing the preservation process, but by perfecting it. Humanity stands on the brink of transcending the limitations of individual consciousness and individual mortality. What I discovered here could revolutionize not just medicine, but human existence itself. By turning everyone into monsters like you, by offering everyone the choice to become something more than human, Edmund's voice replied through thunder. The preservation process is contagious, yes, but only when the subject is willing. It requires conscious acceptance of transformation. I could have infected the entire valley by now if I had chosen to do so. Martha stepped forward, her face showing the strain of 30 years keeping this secret. He's been trying to convince me to undergo the process for decades. The cancer would be irrelevant if I accepted preservation. I would exist indefinitely, maintaining consciousness while my body transformed into something that transcends human limitations. And you've refused? Until now, Martha said quietly. But I'm dying, Claire. And the idea of spending eternity in this state, watching over these creatures, begins to seem preferable to simply ending. Thunder turned his black eyes toward Claire, and she could see something like hope in their depths. The choice is yours, granddaughter. You can attempt to destroy us, though 30 years of experimentation have proven that impossible. You can flee and try to forget what you've learned, though the knowledge will torment you for the rest of your natural life. Or you can join us willingly and help us determine what preserved consciousness is truly capable of becoming. Claire stared at the laboratory around her, at the preserved animals floating in their chambers, at her grandfather's transformed body, and at Thunder, who was somehow all of them and none of them simultaneously. What would happen if I said yes? You would retain your individual consciousness while gaining access to our collective knowledge and experience. You would transcend the limitations of human mortality and human perception. You would become part of something greater than any single mind could achieve. And if I said no? Thunder's expression, somehow visible despite his equine features, grew sad. Then you would leave here, and we would continue our endless existence, waiting for the next person with the courage and scientific understanding to make the choice you refused. Claire felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her like the earth above the underground laboratory. Her grandfather had created something that challenged every assumption about life, death, and consciousness itself. The question was whether that something represented evolution or abomination, and whether she had the wisdom to choose correctly. Claire spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the impossible choice Thunder had presented. She returned to her small motel room in town each evening with her mind reeling from the implications of what she had discovered, only to lie awake, staring at the ceiling as questions multiplied like cancer cells in her consciousness. On the 4th morning, she returned to the laboratory with a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She would undergo the preservation process, not out of scientific curiosity or fear of death, but because someone needed to understand what Edmund had truly created, and she was the only person with both the medical training and the family connection necessary to make that judgment. But as she descended the narrow stairs into the underground laboratory, she noticed something that stopped her cold. Martha was standing beside one of the preservation chambers, but she wasn't alone. A figure Claire didn't recognize, a man in his 60s wearing clothes that looked decades out of date, stood beside her, his hand resting on Martha's shoulder, in a gesture of obvious familiarity. "Who is that?" Claire asked Thunder, who had followed her down the stairs. Thunder's expression, still disturbingly human despite his equine features, grew troubled. "That should not be possible," he said. In Edmund's voice, "We sealed that section 30 years ago." A strange man turned toward them, and Claire felt her blood freeze. His eyes were the same black voids she had seen in all the preserved animals, but his face was undeniably human and undeniably familiar. She had seen this face in old photographs her father had hidden away, pictures from his childhood that he thought he had successfully destroyed. "Hello, Claire," the man said in a voice that carried the weight of 3 decades and the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I've been waiting a long time to meet my granddaughter properly." "That's impossible," Claire whispered. "You're Edmund. You're in the preservation chamber." The man laughed, and the sound was nothing like Edmund's voice emerging from Thunder's throat. This was richer, more complex, carrying harmonics that suggested multiple consciousness speaking simultaneously. "What you see in the chamber is my original body, yes. But the preservation process doesn't confine consciousness to a single form." He gestured to Thunder, to the floating figures in the other chambers, and finally to himself. "I exist in all of these forms simultaneously. The body in the chamber dreams while I walk free, and everything I experience feeds back into the collective consciousness we've created." Martha turned toward Claire, and for the first time since they had met, her expression was one of pure joy. "He came to me 3 days ago, Claire." After decades of existing only through Thunder's voice, Edmund found a way to manifest independently. The preservation process is evolving, becoming something far more sophisticated than we originally understood. "This is what you wanted to show me?" Claire asked. "That the preserved consciousness can create multiple bodies?" "This is what I wanted to prepare you for," Edmund replied, moving toward her with movements that were too fluid, too graceful for any human body. "The choice I offered you through Thunder was incomplete. I didn't tell you about the final stage of preservation, the stage where consciousness transcends the need for any physical form at all." Edmund gestured toward the preservation chambers, and Claire noticed for the first time that several of them were empty, their fluid drained, their occupants nowhere to be seen. "Where are the other preserved animals?" "They've graduated," Edmund said simply. "After decades of suspension, their consciousness evolved beyond the need for physical bodies. They exist now as pure thought, pure awareness, able to inhabit any form or no form as they choose." Thunder stepped forward, his black eyes reflecting a confusion that seemed genuinely distressed. "This was not part of our original discussion, Edmund. We agreed that Claire should choose preservation with full knowledge of what it entailed." "And she will," Edmund replied. "But first, she needs to understand that what I've created isn't just a method of preserving life. It's a pathway to transcending the limitations of physical existence entirely." Claire felt reality shifting around her like quicksand. "You saying the preserved animals can become what? Ghosts? Spirits?" "We prefer the term liberated consciousness," Edmund said. "Free from the constraints of biology, free from the fear of death, free to explore forms of existence that embodied beings cannot even imagine." Martha approached Claire, her eyes bright with the fervor of a convert. "Don't you see? Edmund has solved the fundamental problem of human existence. Not just death, but the limitations imposed by having consciousness trapped in fragile physical bodies. But at what cost? Claire demanded. You've created something that feeds on living creatures, something that violates every principle of natural law. Natural law is a constraint we no longer need to accept, Edmund interrupted. Evolution is a process we can now direct consciously, instead of leaving it to random chance and environmental pressure. What I've created represents the next stage of consciousness itself. Claire looked around the laboratory, noting details she had missed during her previous visits. Equipment that should have been powered down was still running. Monitoring devices showed readouts for biological processes that should no longer exist. And in the corners of the room, she could swear she saw movement shapes that weren't quite visible, presences that seemed to watch her from just beyond the edge of perception. How many of them are there? She asked. How many preserved consciousness are free from their bodies? 7 so far, Edmund replied. Each one chose liberation after decades of physical preservation. Each one now exists as pure thought, able to influence the physical world in ways that embodied consciousness cannot achieve. Thunder made a sound that was part whine, part human. Groan. Edmund, she needs to understand the full implications before she makes any decisions. Tell her about the feeding requirements. Edmund's expression grew darker. The preservation process requires a form of sustenance that embodied beings can provide, but liberated consciousness cannot generate independently. You mean blood, Claire said. Harold Peterson told me you stole blood plasma from his supply room. Blood. Yes, but more than that. The preservation process feeds on life force itself. The electrical and chemical processes that distinguish living tissue from dead matter. Embodied preserved beings like Thunder can extract this directly from living creatures through physical contact. And liberated consciousness requires willing participants, Edmund said. Living beings who consciously choose to share their life force to sustain preserved consciousness. It's a symbiotic relationship. The living being gains access to the collective knowledge and experience of preserved consciousness, while the preserved beings gain the life force necessary to maintain their existence. Claire felt pieces of a horrifying puzzle clicking into place. That's why you've been trying to convince people to undergo preservation. Not to save them from death, but to create a sustainable food source for the beings you've already created. To create a new form of civilization, Edmund corrected. Imagine a world where death is optional, where individual consciousness can choose to remain embodied or transcend into pure thought, where knowledge and experience accumulate across generations instead of being lost to mortality. Martha stepped closer to Claire, her face showing the strain of her advancing cancer, but also something like rapture. He's offering us immortality, Claire. Not just extended life, but existence beyond the limitations that have constrained human consciousness since the beginning of history. Claire looked at Thunder, who had remained silent during this exchange. What do you think? Do you believe this is evolution or abomination? Thunder's voice, when he replied, carried a note of uncertainty that Edmund's confident pronouncements lacked. I am no longer certain I can distinguish between the two. The preservation process has given me access to knowledge and experiences that no single consciousness should possess. I remember being 17 different horses, living and dying dozens of times, existing in states of awareness that have no names in any human language. But are you happy? Claire asked. The question seemed to surprise Thunder. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. Happiness is a concept designed for beings who experience linear time and individual mortality. I exist in a state of perpetual awareness that encompasses both infinite joy and infinite suffering simultaneously. Claire turned back to Edmund, noting that his form seemed less solid than it had moments before, as if maintaining physical manifestation required effort he was struggling to sustain. What happens if I refuse? What happens if I try to expose what you've created? Edmund's smile was sad but not unkind. Then you leave here with knowledge that no one will believe, and we continue our work more carefully. But Claire, consider this: humanity is destroying itself through war, disease, environmental catastrophe, and the simple limitations of individual mortality. What I've created offers a solution to all of those problems. By turning everyone into monsters? By offering everyone the choice to transcend their biological limitations, Edmund replied. The preservation process is not forced. It requires conscious acceptance. Those who choose to remain fully human can do so, but they would benefit from the guidance and protection of those who choose evolution. Claire felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on her shoulders. Her grandfather had created something that challenged every assumption about consciousness, mortality, and the nature of existence itself. But whether that something represented humanity's salvation or its destruction remained terrifyingly unclear. It was then that she noticed something that changed everything. A detail so subtle she almost missed it in the overwhelming strangeness of the moment. Martha's shadow fell across the laboratory floor in the wrong direction, angled away from the light sources in ways that defied physics. And when Claire looked more carefully, she realized Edmund cast no shadow at all. "You're already dead, aren't you?" Claire said suddenly. "Both of you. Martha, you didn't just get cancer. You've already died from it." Martha's expression crumbled, and for a moment her form flickered like a television signal losing reception. 3 weeks ago, she admitted, "I came down here to say goodbye to Edmund before the end, and he offered me the choice. I couldn't face leaving him alone for eternity. And you, grandfather, your body in that preservation chamber isn't alive in any meaningful sense. It's just tissue being maintained by machinery, while your consciousness exists as what? A ghost? A memory?" Edmund's form solidified again, but Claire could see the effort it cost him. "We prefer to think of ourselves as the next stage of human evolution. Death is simply a transition we've learned to navigate consciously rather than allowing it to end our existence." "But you're feeding on the living to maintain these forms," Claire realized. That's what the blood was for, what the life force requirement really means. You're parasites, sustaining your unnatural existence by draining life from others. Thunder's voice carried a note of profound sadness. "Now you begin to understand why I expressed uncertainty about the nature of what we've become. We exist by consuming the very thing we claim to be preserving." Claire looked around the laboratory with new eyes, seeing it not as a scientific breakthrough, but as the epicenter of something deeply wrong, a violation of natural law that had been spreading through Millbrook Valley for 30 years, sustained by the unwitting sacrifice of living creatures who had no understanding of what they were feeding. "The other animals in the valley," she said, "the ones Harald photographed, the ones standing motionless in fields, they're not preserved. They're being drained." Edmund nodded, his expression showing neither shame nor regret. "The preservation process creates a network of connection between all affected beings. Those who achieve full preservation, like myself and Martha, require sustenance that can be drawn from any connected creature within the network. It's a more efficient system than individual predation. You've turned an entire ecosystem into your feeding ground. We've created a sustainable model for post-human existence," Edmund corrected. "The animals provide life force. We provide protection and guidance. It's a symbiotic relationship that could serve as a template for a new form of civilization." Claire felt a clarity descend on her that was both terrifying and liberating. She understood now what choice she was really facing, not between life and death, not between human and posthuman existence, but between complicity in a horror that masqueraded as evolution and the responsibility to end something that should never have been allowed to continue. "There's one thing you haven't told me," she said to Edmund. You mentioned that preserved consciousness can be destroyed, that you tried to eliminate the animals with fire and failed. But there must be a way. You wouldn't have offered me this choice if you thought I was completely powerless to oppose you. Edmund's form flickered again, more dramatically this time. Clever girl. Yes, there is a way. But it would require sacrificing everything, not just our continued existence, but all the knowledge and experience we've accumulated, all the potential for what humanity could become. Thunder stepped forward, his black eyes reflecting something that might have been hope. Tell her, Edmund. If she's going to make this choice, she deserves to know all the options. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his form becoming progressively less solid. The preservation chamber that holds my original body contains an emergency protocol, a compound I developed during my final weeks that would reverse the preservation process permanently. But using it would cascade through the entire network, destroying every preserved consciousness simultaneously. Including yours, including all of us. Every preserved animal, every liberated consciousness, every connection in a network we've created. It would be the complete annihilation of 30 years of evolution beyond human limitations. Claire felt a strange peace settling over her as the full scope of her choice became clear. She could join her grandfather's posthuman collective, contributing her knowledge and consciousness to their continued existence while accepting complicity in their parasitic feeding. She could flee and try to forget, leaving the horror to continue its slow expansion through the valley and potentially beyond. Or she could end it all destroying not just the monsters Edmund had created, but also the legitimate scientific discoveries that had made their creation possible. What happens to you if I activate the reversal protocol? She asked. We cease to exist in any form, Edmund replied simply. No transcendence, no preservation, no continuation of consciousness beyond biological. Death, complete and permanent extinction. Martha's form was becoming increasingly transparent, the effort of maintaining physical manifestation clearly exhausting her limited resources. Claire, don't let our mistakes blind you to what we've learned. The knowledge we've gained about consciousness, about the nature of existence itself. It could benefit all of humanity if properly developed. Under your model, it would enslave all of humanity, Claire replied. You've created a system that requires the consumption of life, forced to sustain unnatural existence. That's not evolution, that's predation disguised as progress. Thunder's voice, when he spoke, carried a finality that suggested the end of a very long internal debate. She's right, Edmund. What we've become is not what you intended, but it is what we are, and what we are should not be allowed to continue. Edmund's form began to dissolve entirely, his voice becoming distant and ethereal. The choice is yours, granddaughter. But remember, some knowledge, once lost, can never be recovered. Some opportunities, once rejected, never come again. As Edmund's presence faded entirely and Martha's form flickered like a candle in wind, Claire was left alone with Thunder, the first and last of the successfully preserved animals, the hybrid. Consciousness that contained both horse and human awareness, the key to ending a horror that had masqueraded as scientific breakthrough for 30 years. Are you ready? Thunder asked in Edmund's voice. Claire looked at the preservation chamber containing her grandfather's original body, at the machinery that had sustained an abomination for 3 decades, at the evidence of humanity's capacity to create monsters, while believing it was achieving miracles. I'm ready, she said. The reversal protocol was about to begin. Thunder led Claire to a section of the laboratory she hadn't previously explored, a sealed chamber behind the main preservation tanks that required both a physical key and what appeared to be a biometric scanner. The scanner's red light shifted to green when Thunder placed what looked like a hoof against its surface. But Claire noticed the appendage was far more articulated than any horse's foot should be. Edmund designed multiple fail-safes, Thunder explained as the chamber door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. He was paranoid that his work might be discovered and misused by others, but he was equally concerned that it might need to be completely destroyed if the preservation process proved uncontrollable. Inside the chamber, Claire found herself looking at equipment that seemed decades ahead of anything she had seen in her veterinary training. Complex chemical synthesis apparatus lined the walls, connected by tubing that pulsed with fluids of various colors. At the center of the room stood a device that looked like a cross between a medical scanner and some kind of particle accelerator. A cylindrical chamber surrounded by electromagnetic coils and monitoring equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. The reversal protocol requires precise timing and specific chemical compounds. Thunder continued. Edmund spent his final weeks developing an antidote to his own preservation process, but he never had the opportunity to test it on fully established preserved consciousness. Claire approached the central device, noting readouts that showed energy patterns she didn't recognize. How does it work? The preservation compound creates quantum entanglement between all affected consciousness within the network. This device generates a specific electromagnetic pulse that disrupts that entanglement, causing all preserved tissue to revert to normal biological processes simultaneously. And normal biological processes for tissue that's been preserved for 30 years means immediate death. Thunder finished. Everything that should have died decades ago will die properly. Everything that has been sustained by unnatural means will find natural rest. Claire studied the control panel, noting that the device appeared to be already powered up and ready for activation. You've been preparing for this moment, haven't you? You've wanted this to end for a long time. Thunder's expression, somehow visible despite his equine features, showed a weariness that seemed to encompass decades of existential exhaustion. I have experienced every moment of the last 30 years simultaneously. I remember being Thunder the horse, dying from lightning strike. I remember being Edmund the scientist, consumed with guilt over his creations. I remember being 17. Other preserved animals, each with their own consciousness gradually dissolving into our collective awareness. That sounds like hell. It is neither heaven nor hell. It is something else entirely, something that consciousness was never meant to endure. Individual identity becomes meaningless when you experience existence through dozens of different perspectives simultaneously. Joy and suffering, memory and anticipation, self and other, all distinctions blur into a constant state of overwhelming awareness. Claire found herself looking at readouts that showed the current status of the preservation network. Dozens of indicators displayed active connections throughout the valley. Every animal that Harold had photographed, every creature that had been touched by the spreading influence of Edmund's experiment, all of them connected in a web of unnatural existence that centered on this underground laboratory. How many living creatures are being drained to sustain this network? Thunder was quiet for a moment, accessing information from sources Claire couldn't imagine. Currently, approximately 400 animals within a 20-mile radius are providing life force to sustain 47 preserved consciousness. The ratio has been worsening as more creatures achieve liberation from physical form. 400, Claire repeated, feeling the weight of those numbers. 400 animals living in a state of slow consumption, their life force being siphoned. A way to feed your grandfather's abominations. The process is not painful for them, Thunder said, though his voice carried no conviction. They exist in a state of suspended animation, unaware of their condition, but aware enough to watch me with intelligent eyes when I approach them, Claire countered. Aware enough to track movement and react to changes in their environment. You've created a valley full of prisoners, trapped in bodies that can't die but can't truly live. Thunder nodded, acknowledging the accuracy of her assessment. This is why the reversal protocol exists. Edmund may have convinced himself that We represent evolution, but he retained enough humanity to recognize that we might represent something else entirely. Claire began examining the chemical synthesis equipment, trying to understand the process that would be required to activate the reversal protocol. The compounds involved were unlike anything in her veterinary training, exotic molecules that seemed to exist at the intersection of biochemistry and quantum physics. "How long will the synthesis take?" she asked. "The compounds are already prepared," Thunder replied. Edmund spent weeks before his disappearance creating enough reversal agent to destroy the entire network. The device has been ready for activation for 30 years. It required only someone with the knowledge and will to use it. And you couldn't activate it yourself? The failsafes require human DNA to authorize activation. Edmund designed it so that only a member of his family could make the final decision about whether his work should continue or be destroyed. Claire felt the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders like lead. Her grandfather had created a horror that had been spreading through Millbrook Valley for 3 decades, but he had also ensured that the power to end that horror would rest with someone who carried his genetic legacy. "What happens to you specifically when I activate this device?" she asked. Thunder's voice carried a note of something that might have been anticipation. "My consciousness will fragment back into its component parts. Thunder the horse will experience the death he should have had 30 years ago. Edmund's preserved awareness will dissolve. The 17 other animal consciousness that have become part of our collective will find individual rest. And the liberated consciousness, Edmund and Martha in their non-physical forms, they will simply cease to exist. No transcendence, no afterlife, no continuation of awareness in any form. Complete extinction." Claire looked around the chamber, noting that some of the monitoring equipment was showing increased activity. "Are they aware that we're down here? Do they know what we're planning?" "Yes," Thunder replied. "The network connection means that all preserved consciousness share awareness of current events. They are distressed by your decision, as if summoned." By their conversation, the air in the chamber began to shimmer, and Claire could see the translucent forms of Edmund and Martha beginning to materialize. Their faces showed a mixture of desperation and anger that made Claire take an involuntary step backward. "Claire, please," Edmund's voice echoed from multiple directions simultaneously. "You don't understand what you're about to destroy. 30 years of research, breakthrough discoveries about the nature of consciousness itself, the potential for humanity to transcend every limitation that has constrained our species since the beginning of history." Martha's form solidified enough to approach Claire directly, her expression pleading. "We can modify the process, eliminate the feeding requirements. With your help, we could develop a form of preservation that doesn't require life force from other creatures." "Based on what?" Claire demanded. 30 years of trial and error have only made the situation worse. You've created a system that requires the consumption of life force to sustain unnatural existence. That's not a design flaw. That's the fundamental nature of what you've become." Thunder stepped between Claire and the manifesting spirits, his form somehow more solid and present than theirs. "She has made her decision, Edmund. Accept it with whatever grace you can manage." Edmund's form began to pulse with energy that made the monitoring equipment register dangerous fluctuations. "I will not allow 30 years of work to be destroyed by a child who lacks the vision to understand what we've accomplished." "You don't get a choice anymore," Claire said, moving toward the activation controls. "You lost the right to make choices when you decided that your scientific curiosity was more important than the lives of every creature in this valley." The electromagnetic coils around the central device began to glow as Claire initiated the STARTUP sequence. The reversal protocol would take approximately 10 minutes to reach full power, during which time the preserved consciousness in the network would experience a gradual dissolution of their quantum entanglement. "Claire, I'm begging you." Martha's voice carried the desperation of someone facing complete extinction. "I know what we've become is wrong, but the knowledge we've gained, it could be used to help people. Medical breakthroughs, consciousness research, understanding the nature of existence itself. Knowledge gained through the suffering of innocence has no value," Claire replied, watching as readouts showed the reversal process beginning throughout the network. "Some discoveries aren't worth making if they require becoming monsters in the process." Thunder's voice carried a note of profound relief as the quantum entanglement that had bound him to the collective for 30 years began to weaken. "I can feel them separating," he said. "The individual consciousness are beginning to distinguish themselves from the collective awareness. For the first time in decades, I remember what it feels like to be a single individual rather than a fragment of something larger." The manifested forms of Edmund and Martha began to flicker more violently as the reversal process affected their ability to maintain coherent existence outside their physical vessels. Their voices, when they spoke, carried increasing distortion and desperation. "You're destroying the future of human consciousness itself," Edmund's voice echoed through the chamber. "When humanity faces extinction from war or disease or environmental collapse, they will curse your name for destroying their chance at transcendence." Claire watched the readouts as the reversal process spread through the network, reaching preserved animals throughout the valley. In farmhouses and pastures across 20 miles of countryside, creatures that had stood in unnatural stillness for decades would finally be allowed the rest they should have found long ago. "Maybe they'll curse my name," Claire said quietly, "but they'll do it as living, individual, mortal beings who get to make their own choices about transcendence, rather than having it forced on them by parasites who disguise predation as progress." Thunder's form was beginning to shimmer as the preservation process that had sustained him for 30 years gradually reversed itself. "Thank you," he said in a voice that was purely equine, no longer carrying Edmund's consciousness. "Thank you for letting me die properly." 5 minutes remaining until complete. Network dissolution. Claire stood watch over the device that would end 30 years of horror, feeling the weight of her decision but no regret. Some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve, and some evolution led only to predation. Her grandfather had created monsters while believing he was saving the world. Now, it was time for those monsters to find peace. The reversal device reached critical power levels with 3 minutes remaining on the countdown, and the underground laboratory began to shake as 30 years of accumulated unnatural energy fought against its dissolution. Claire gripped the control panel as equipment throughout the chamber sparked and hummed with overloaded circuits, while Thunder's form flickered between solidity and transparency like a television signal losing reception. Edmund's manifested consciousness made one final desperate attempt to stop the process, his spirit form solidifying enough to reach toward the emergency shutdown controls. But his fingers passed through the physical switches. The reversal protocol had already weakened his connection to the material world beyond any ability to affect it directly. "The network is fragmenting," Thunder said, his voice carrying wonder and relief as individual awareness returned to him for the first time in decades. "I can feel the other consciousness separating, finding their individual identities again before." He paused, his equine features showing something like peace. "Before we find rest." Claire watched the main display as indicators throughout the valley shifted from active to dissolving. Each light represented a preserved creature finally being released from the unnatural state that had trapped it between life and death for years or decades. The process wasn't instantaneous. Each animal would experience a brief moment of restored individual consciousness before natural death claimed them properly. Martha's spirit form approached the preservation chamber containing Edmund's original body. Her translucent hand pressed against the glass as if trying to touch him one final time. 30 years, she whispered, her voice growing fainter as the network connection that sustained her existence weakened. 30 years of existence beyond death, and now we face extinction with no knowledge of what comes after. The same thing? That comes after for everyone else, Claire replied, watching as the electromagnetic coils around the reversal device began to glow white-hot. The same mystery that every living being faces when their time ends naturally. Thunder's physical form was beginning to show the signs of natural horse mortality that had been suspended for 3 decades. His coat dulling, his breathing becoming labored, his movements showing the stiffness of advanced age. But his eyes, no longer the black voids of preserved consciousness, had returned to their natural brown, and they held an intelligence that was purely equine. I remember being struck by lightning, he said, his voice now entirely his own rather than Edmund's. I remember the pain and the darkness, and then waking up in that laboratory with my mind full of human thoughts and knowledge I never asked for. It will be good to be just a horse again, even if only for a moment. With 60 seconds remaining on the countdown, the laboratory's emergency lighting, activated as the main power systems, began failing under the strain of the reversal process. In the red-tinged illumination, Claire could see cracks appearing in the concrete walls as the very foundation of Edmund's underground facility began to destabilize. Edmund's spirit form made a final attempt at communication, his voice now barely audible above the sound of failing machinery. Claire, you don't understand the implications of what you're doing. The preserved consciousness contains the memories and experiences of hundreds of individual beings. When you destroy us, you're destroying irreplaceable knowledge about the nature of existence itself. Knowledge built on suffering and sustained by predation, Claire replied firmly. Some understanding isn't worth the price of obtaining it. The preservation chambers throughout the laboratory began draining as the reversal process reached them, and Claire watched as the bodies of 17 animals that had been suspended in unnatural preservation for decades experienced rapid decomposition. The tissue that had been held in stasis by Edmund's compounds quickly reverted to the state it should have reached years ago. Returning to the earth with the dignity of natural death, Thunder approached Claire one final time, his movements now showing the careful gait of an elderly horse whose joints carried the weight of his true age. Thank you, he said simply, for giving me the death I should have had 30 years ago, and for ensuring that no one else will be trapped as we were. With 30 seconds remaining, Martha's form began to fade entirely, her connection to the network too weak to maintain. Manifestation. Edmund, she called out to her lover's spirit. I can feel myself dissolving. Whatever comes next, I'm glad we'll face it together. Edmund's consciousness, no longer sustained by the network connection, began experiencing the final dissolution that natural death should have brought him decades ago. The work, he whispered as his form flickered like a candle in wind. The breakthrough, all of it lost. Not lost, Claire said firmly. Ended, as it should have been 30 years ago. 10 seconds. Thunder's breathing became increasingly labored as his body finally acknowledged the mortal injuries that had been suspended since 1987, but his eyes remained calm, showing no fear of the approaching end. 5 seconds. The electromagnetic pulse reached full power, sending waves of reversal energy through every connection in the preservation network. 3 seconds. Thunder looked at Claire one final time and spoke in a voice that held nothing but gratitude. Thank you for letting me go home. The reversal protocol activated. The electromagnetic pulse erupted from the reversal device with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, sending waves of dissolution energy through every quantum connection in the preservation network. Claire felt the pulse pass through her own body, a sensation like ice water in her veins, followed by a warmth that spoke of natural biological processes, reasserting themselves over anything that might have been touched by Edmund's unnatural Influence. Thunder's form solidified one final time as the preservation compounds in his system neutralized completely, allowing him to experience a moment of perfect, natural horse consciousness before the lightning injuries from 1987 claimed him properly. His eyes met Claire's, and she saw in them a peace that transcended the fear of death, the relief of a creature finally allowed to complete a journey that had been interrupted for 30 years. "Goodbye," Thunder whispered, and then he was gone, not dissolved into spirit form like the preserved consciousness, but truly dead in the way that all living beings were meant to die. His body remained, but it was now simply the corpse of an elderly horse who had finally found rest after decades of unnatural existence. Throughout the valley above, the same peaceful ending was occurring simultaneously. In pastures and farmyards across 20 miles of countryside, animals that had stood in motionless preservation suddenly experienced brief moments of restored individual consciousness before natural death claimed them. The gray mare that had watched Claire with ancient eyes finally closed them for the last time. The bull that had terrified Robert Jenkins 3 decades ago lay down in his field and breathed his last natural breath. Dozens of creatures that had been trapped between life and death were finally allowed to go home. Edmund's preserved body, in the main chamber, underwent rapid decomposition as 30 years of suspended decay occurred in moments. But this wasn't the grotesque corruption that might be expected. Instead, the tissue simply returned to Earth with the same dignity that attended all natural death. The preservation compounds that had held him in unnatural stasis neutralized completely, allowing his remains to join the cycle of death and renewal that he had sought to transcend. Martha's spirit form disappeared entirely as the network connection that had sustained her post-death consciousness dissolved. Her final words, barely audible above the sound of collapsing machinery, carried no regret. "At last rest." Edmund's liberated consciousness fought the dissolution longer than the others, his scientific mind struggling to maintain coherence, even as the quantum entanglement that defined his existence unraveled. "The knowledge," he gasped as his form flickered between visibility and void. 30 years of research into the nature of consciousness itself will die with you," Claire said firmly, watching as the laboratory around them began to collapse. As it should. Some discoveries are too dangerous to preserve. The reversal device overloaded completely as it expended the last of its energy, sending cascades of sparks through the underground facility. Concrete cracked and shifted as the foundation that had supported Edmund's laboratory for 3 decades finally succumbed to structural failure. Water began seeping through the walls as underground springs, no longer held back by the unnatural energy that had pervaded the space, reclaimed the earth. Claire ran for the stairs as the ceiling began to sag, feeling pieces of concrete rain down around her. Behind her, she could hear the sound of preservation equipment collapsing, chemical tanks rupturing, and 30 years of accumulated research apparatus. Returning to scrap metal and broken glass, she emerged from the underground laboratory just as the entrance stairway collapsed entirely, sealing the facility beneath tons of earth and debris. The stable above shook once, as if acknowledging the end of the horror that had festered beneath it for decades, and then fell silent in the sudden quiet that followed. Claire could hear something she hadn't noticed during her previous visits to the valley. The natural sounds of living countryside, birds singing in the oak trees, wind rustling through leaves, the distant lowing of cattle that moved and breathed and lived in the normal rhythms of biological existence. The preservation network was completely dissolved. Claire walked slowly through the stable, noting that the oppressive atmosphere that had pervaded the building was gone. The air smelled of hay and horses and autumn leaves, natural scents that spoke of life proceeding according to its proper cycles, rather than being trapped in unnatural suspension. She found her phone and dialed her father's number, knowing that He would be waiting anxiously for word of what had transpired in Millbrook Valley. "Dad," she said when he answered on the first ring, "it's over. Edmund's work has been completely destroyed. The preserved animals are finally at rest." David's voice carried a relief that seemed to encompass 30 years of buried guilt and fear. "And you? Are you all right?" Claire looked around the now empty stable, feeling the weight of what she had witnessed and chosen to end. "I'm alive, I'm human, and I'm mortal. Right now, that feels like the most precious combination in the world. Come home, Claire. Come home and let this place return to what it should have been before Edmund ever began his experiments." As Claire walked toward her car, she could swear she heard Thunder's voice one final time, carried on the autumn wind. "Thank you." The curse of the Hammond family had finally been laid to rest. 6 months after the destruction of the preservation network, Claire stood in the spring sunshine outside the newly renovated Caldwell stable, watching as a young Arabian mare named Starfire played in the paddock with the natural exuberance of a truly living animal. The mare's coat gleamed with health, her movements flowed with organic grace, and her eyes held the bright intelligence of a creature who had never known anything but normal equine existence. Claire had returned to Millbrook Valley immediately, after completing her Doctor of Veterinary Medicine degree, drawn back to the place where she had confronted the darkest aspects of her family legacy. The stable had been rebuilt from the foundation up, constructed over the sealed remains of Edmund's laboratory with deliberate symbolism new life, growing from the grave of old horrors. Harold Peterson had helped with the reconstruction, donating materials and labor with the enthusiasm of a man finally freed from 30 years of carrying terrible secrets. The new stable was smaller than Martha's original facility, designed not for end-of-life care, but for healthy animals living normal lifespans under conventional veterinary medicine. "Dr. Hamilton," called a familiar voice, and Claire turned to see her father approaching from the packing area. David had aged visibly in the months since the events at the old laboratory, but the change was one of relief rather than stress. The deep lines around his eyes spoke of a man finally able to sleep peacefully after decades of nightmares. "Still, sounds strange," Claire admitted, embracing her father warmly. "I keep expecting people to call me Dr. Hammond." "The name change served its purpose," David replied, looking around the rebuilt stable with obvious satisfaction. "But I think it's time we reclaimed our family identity properly. Not the shame Edmund brought to it, but the healing you've brought to this place." Above the stable's main entrance, 2 veterinary diplomas hung in places of honor. Edmund's original certificate from 1962 had been restored and reframed, displayed alongside Claire's fresh diploma from Cornell. The juxtaposition spoke to the complexity of legacy, how the same knowledge and training that had enabled one generation to create horrors could empower the next generation to heal the damage. "Have you decided about the job offer from the university?" David asked as they walked through the stable, noting the improvements Claire had made to the facility. "I've decided to stay here," Claire replied. "The valley needs a veterinarian who understands what happened, who can ensure that nothing like Edmund's work ever takes root here again." "And the research proposals? The papers you could publish about what you discovered?" Claire paused at the stall where Thunder had spent his final months, now home to a healthy gelding whose only concern was the quality of his hay. "Some knowledge dies with the generation that created it, Dad. The world is safer not knowing the details of what Edmund accomplished." They walked outside to where a small memorial garden had been planted over the exact location of the laboratory's main entrance. Native wildflowers bloomed in carefully tended beds, while a simple stone marker bore an inscription that Claire had chosen carefully, in memory of all creatures who suffered in the name of science, and in honor of those who chose mercy over knowledge. "I've been thinking about Thunder a lot lately," David said, settling on a bench that faced the memorial garden. About what he said at the end, thanking you for letting him go home. Do you think he really found peace? Claire asked, sitting beside her father. I think he found what every conscious being deserves, the right to complete his natural journey without interference from those who think they know better than the processes that govern life and death. A car pulled into the stable's packing area, and Claire recognized Dr. Sarah Chun, her former supervising veterinarian from Cornell. Sarah had driven up from the city to attend the stable's official reopening ceremony, bringing with her a gift that made Claire's breath catch with surprise. I thought you might want to see this, Sarah said, presenting Claire with a leather journal new, unmarked, waiting to be filled with the kind of veterinary case notes that spoke of healing rather than harm. To replace the one that was lost, Sarah continued, for recording the good work you'll do here, the lives you'll save through conventional medicine and ethical practice. Claire accepted the journal with hands that trembled slightly, understanding the symbolism Sarah intended. This would be her record of legitimate veterinary medicine treatments that extended life naturally, procedures that healed without violating the fundamental principles of biological existence, case notes that documented hope rather than horror. Thank you, Claire said simply. I promise it will contain only the kind of work that honors the profession rather than perverting it. As the afternoon sun slanted through the oak trees surrounding the memorial garden, other members of the community began arriving for the ceremony. Many were families whose animals had been affected by Edmund's preservation, network people who had lived for years with creatures trapped in unnatural states, not understanding what they were witnessing, but knowing instinctively that something was wrong. Robert Jenkins, now in his 80s, approached Claire with obvious gratitude. My granddaughter's pony, Buttercup's daughter, she's normal now. Plays and runs and acts like a regular horse should. Whatever you did that night 6 months ago, it freed more than just the animals that were directly affected. The preservation process was spreading through bloodlines, Claire explained gently. Ending the network allowed all affected genetic material to revert to natural patterns. Your granddaughter's pony was never in danger of becoming like her mother, but she might have carried dormant compounds that could have affected her own offspring. A generational curse, Robert said, nodding with understanding. And you broke it completely. Claire looked around at the gathered community farmers and horse owners, veterinary colleagues from neighboring counties, even a few reporters who had been drawn to the story of a stable's resurrection after mysterious years of decline. None of them knew the full truth of what had transpired beneath this ground, and that was exactly as it should be. The formal ceremony was brief and focused on the future rather than the past. Claire spoke about her commitment to ethical veterinary practice, her plans to establish a scholarship fund for rural veterinary students, and her intention to make Millbrook Valley a model for how science and compassion could work together to serve both animals and their human companions. As the crowd dispersed in the early evening light, Claire found herself alone in the memorial garden with one final visitor, an elderly woman she didn't recognize, who had waited patiently through the ceremony without participating in the celebration. You must be Claire, the woman said, approaching with the careful movements of advanced age. I'm Eleanor Morrison. Jenny was my daughter. Claire felt a chill of recognition. Jenny Morrison, the little girl whose pony had attacked her after Edmund's treatment, whose wounds had begun showing signs of spreading preservation infection. Is she? Claire began, then stopped, unsure how to ask about someone who had been exposed to the preservation compound as a child. She died 2 years ago, Eleanor said simply. Cancer. But she died as a normal human being, with a husband and children who will live normal human lives. The infection you stopped, it would have spread to them eventually, wouldn't it? Claire nodded, understanding the true scope of what the reversal protocol had prevented. The preservation process was becoming more sophisticated over time, without intervention. It would have eventually affected everyone who had contact with preserved animals or their descendants. Then you saved my grandchildren's lives, Eleanor said, reaching into her purse and withdrawing a small wrapped package. This belonged to Jenny. She kept it all these years, even though it reminded her of something terrible. I think she would have wanted you to have it. Claire unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a child's drawing in faded crayon, a little girl standing beside a pony, both figures smiling under a bright yellow sun. Normal, happy, alive in the way that all living things should be alive. Thank you, Claire whispered, understanding that this simple drawing represented everything she had fought to preserve, the right of every conscious being to exist according to natural law, to love and fear and hope and die in the rhythms that had governed life since its beginning. As Eleanor walked away into the gathering dusk, Claire remained in the memorial garden, holding the drawing and listening to the sounds of genuine countryside evening owls beginning their hunt, cattle settling for the night, horses nickering softly to each other across paddock fences. Normal sounds, living sounds, sounds that spoke of a world where death was natural and life was precious because it was temporary. She opened the new journal Sarah had given her and wrote her first entry by the fading light. Day 1. Establish new practice in Millbrook Valley. Examined 12 horses, 2 with minor lameness, 1 requiring routine vaccination update. All animals showed normal vital signs and natural behavioral patterns. No evidence of preservation compound influence in any examined subjects. Note 4. Future generations. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. Some discoveries lead only to suffering. The greatest gift we can give to those who come after us is the wisdom to recognize when the pursuit of transcendence leads away from the very things that make life meaningful: individual consciousness, natural mortality, and the courage to find meaning in the time we are given rather than demanding eternity. Claire closed the journal and walked back toward the stable, where the night shift routine of caring for healthy, living, mortal animals awaited her. Behind her, the memorial garden held its silent vigil over the buried remains of Edmund's laboratory, ensuring that some secrets would remain forever sealed beneath the earth. In the distance, she could hear Thunder's voice one final time, carried on the wind like a blessing. Thank you for bringing us home. The curse of the Hammond family was ended. The work of healing could begin.